Well, we're here with Carol Costello, and for you long-time WAKR listeners, and back then even viewers, you might remember Carol got her start. She's from Minerva. She went to Kent State and then got her start right here at WAKR. And of course, since then, CNN, headline news, and now actually teaching journalism at Loyola Marymount in California. But something struck her way back in the early 1980s, and I'm going to let her take it and run with it here. Back in 1984, with a violent crime that was one of the first ones that she covered right here in the greater Akron area and has stuck with her for over 30 years. And she is now, starting today, dropping a podcast on this incident. So, Carol, thanks for joining us on WAKR, and welcome back, I should say, to WAKR. And then go into the story that unfortunately has stuck with you through all these years.
I know. I think I feel like I've come full circle. Here I am back at WAKR. It feels really weird and really nice. But you're right. One of the first big sensational stories that I covered happened to me at WAKR. I started working at WAKR TV 23 when I was about 22 years old. And came right out of college. And you know, when you're a young reporter, you kind of don't know what you're doing. You pretend a lot. You have great mentors, which I did in Larry States. And I'm sure we all remember Larry States. Love him.
Love him.
Love. But you're assigned really big stories that you're really not psychologically prepared for or professionally prepared for, right? Just because you're young and you're green and you're learning on the job, which is what you do in smaller markets or in bigger markets, depending on where you start. So the first big case I covered was the case involving Phyllis Cottles. She was the most courageous, amazing person that I have ever met. And, you know, I covered a lot of cases and I've met a lot of people. I covered huge stories. I covered Sandy Hook. I covered 9/11. I covered the Pulse nightclub shooting. I've covered a lot of really bad stuff. But this one case involving Phyllis Cottles has stuck with me for all of these years because Phyllis Cottles is the kind of person who just gets under your skin in the very best way. What happened to her, it's just mind-boggling.
Mm-hmm.
She was abducted in broad daylight from work. She was carjacked. She was driven to a vacant house and where she was raped repeatedly. Then her assailant took her to a bank and tried to rob her of her money. He took her back to the vacant house and assaulted her again. And then he did the most awful thing imaginable. He asked her if she was going to go to the police. And she goes, "No, I won't tell. Just let me go. I've done everything you asked. Let me go." And he said, "I don't believe you because they all lied. They all went to the police." So he put her back in the car. He tied her up. And I don't know, do you want me to go into detail about exactly what happened to her? Because it's all online, probably.
Yeah, I mean, it's just horrific with the description, but he ended up locking her in the car, in a burning car, and stabbed her in her eyes, taking her sight from her. I guess, you know, I don't need to go in great detail, but that signified that she wasn't going to be able to see again.
That's correct. So he blinded her. He left her tied up in that car. He doused her body with some flammable liquid along with the front seat of the car. And then he set the car on fire, locked the doors, and off he ran. Now, I talked to a lot of people back then and even today who will say to me, "Oh my God, I can't believe she survived. And why did she even want to survive that? Who could survive that?" But Phyllis did. And it's not like she was inside that burning car praying to God. She wasn't a religious person, and like it was a little late, right? for God to come to her aid. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She said this rage built up inside her. And she said to herself, that bastard's not going to fry me. I'm going to fry him. And somehow she found the will to unlock the car and roll away from that burning car. You know, that's just the beginning of Phyllis's story. That is not Phyllis's story. Phyllis's story to me is her quest for justice. She became like a member of the team investigating her case. And detectives said that to me to this day. She made it her mission that justice would be served so he wouldn't hurt anyone else like he hurt her. And for the rest of her life, she helped other victims, blind victims, rape victims. She was the most courageous, wonderful person I have ever met. And that's the story I want to tell about Phyllis Cottle.
With us is Carol Costello here on WAKR. Got her start here as you hear her story about Phyllis Cottle and CNN headline news and now teaching journalism. You mentioned at the outset, Carol, that this story, and you have covered some stories, this one has always stuck with you. You and I talked last week in preparing for her interview. And by the way, Carol mentioned that she didn't scream with rage or anything, but if you go back, I was reading transcripts of this. She was actually screaming and looking for help that night, and no one answered her screams. They thought it was a domestic dispute, and no one came. But anyways, Carol, talk about why.
No, let me explain that part. So when
Go
when she was abducted in broad daylight, it was new, broad daylight. The assailant approached her from behind and hit her on the back of the head with a gym bag. He also had a knife. She did everything she was supposed to do. She screamed. She laid on the horn. She called for help. She hit him, and no one came to her aid. No one. So her ordeal lasted, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours.
Oh,
So at that last moment when she was in the car and the car was on fire, she knew that there would be no knight in shining armor riding to her rescue, right? It was up to her. It was up to her to seek justice for herself. And at that moment, she just had it. She was going to fight back. She wasn't going to let him break her. And that's when she was filled with rage and got out of that car and became so angry, and her quest for justice began.
by the way, Phyllis passed away of cancer back in 2013 at the age of 73. So let me get to my question. Why has this story stuck with you for 35 years? And then get into the podcast of what you put together that drops today with the first part.
You know, it was, I've never been able to answer that question. Why this story? Why Phyllis? I had to do a lot of soul searching in putting this podcast together to come up with why her, right? I think a lot of it had to do with the time. I was 22, was very difficult for women in those days to make it in a man's world, and broadcasting was very much a man's world back in the day, 1984, right? So I was struggling there. A traumatic event happened to me in college, which I have never been able to talk about, but I blamed myself for that. And I think a part of me was looking for a hero, somebody to show me that there was a way to recovery, there was a way to be strong, there was a way to be happy. And I found that in Phyllis Cottle. I think that was a big reason why her story stuck with me all these years. I also got to know Phyllis over the years and was always impressed with her outlook on life. She's very Midwest, right? She was like, matter of fact, move on, get shit done. She was very much that. And that always impressed me, because ultimately when you're waiting through a difficult situation, you have to boil it down to the simple facts and just get it done and not worry about all that other stuff surrounding it, all the political stuff surrounding what you do at work. You just have to get down to brass tacks and get it done. And I think that I gained strength in talking to Phyllis over the years. because she was that kind of person. So I think for those reasons, her story stuck with me. Also, in the 80s, it was a very strange time for women. You could still rape your wife, and it was legal in Ohio in 1984. The term date rape had just popped into the public consciousness along with victim blaming. Women still don't go to the police in numbers like they should to report sexual assaults, but they sure didn't in 1984. They sure didn't go public in 1984 to say what happened to them because they blamed themselves, not Phyllis. Phyllis went full face. She was one of the first women who made her name public and her story public with all the gory details because she wanted people to know that this crime was not her fault in any way, shape, or form. It was his fault. That really resonated with me.
His name's Samuel Herring, by the way, 300 years in prison, sentenced up for parole again in 2029. As I mentioned, first part of this podcast is dropping today. So Carol, how can people listen in and take in the podcast? Let's talk about that side.
So the podcast is called Carol Costello Presents Blind Rage, but you can Google Blind Rage. You can get it wherever you listen to your podcast. It will pop up for you. It's a 10-part series. So the first part will drop today, and then every week a new episode will air. I go through it all. I describe what happened to Phyllis, how she dealt with it, how police investigated. I talked to the detectives who investigated the case back then. I talked to the prosecutors. I talked to Phyllis's family and her friends. Oh, there's just so many interesting side stories to Phyllis's story, like how the media covered it back in the day was incredibly sensational. There were people hiding out at her house in her shrubbery, trying to get a picture of this rape victim, which was unconscionable. Nobody from WAKR did that, by the way. But it did teach me a lot about reporting and about the lengths reporters will go to get the story. And what's right or wrong is kind of a, it's a gray, muddy middle. There is no right and wrong. Because at one hand, you say, how could you even approach Phyllis? I mean, after what she's been through to talk. But on the other hand, Phyllis wanted to share her story. She wanted to do that on her own terms, though. Mm-hmm. So what is the right thing as a reporter to do? So we go into all of that as well. It's just such an interesting story. And the way she dealt with what happened to her and the outcome, to me, is incredibly interesting. And also, what kind of person does this to a woman? What kind of person? And we go into a little bit about that too.
It sounds like she is the perfect person to tell this story. Carol Costello has been with us on WAKR. Again, it's Carol Costello, Blind Rage. The podcast drops today. We are going to try to connect with Carol periodically as these podcasts drop and talk to her as this series goes on, certainly with, unfortunately, it happening in Akron. There's a lot of people, I'm sure, that remember Carol and WAKR's coverage of this event. So we're going to stay in touch with you, Carol, if you don't mind, and continue to get updates. I can tell during your delivery today, it's still very emotional for you. And that's why I said, I think you're the perfect person to tell this story from Phyllis's perspective, your perspective, and taking us back to the mid 1980s. So thank you for joining me this morning. I'll stay in touch, and great work. Great work.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate it.
Perfect. That's good. All done.
Awesome.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Do you mind if, what are you dropping a new one every week, or how are you doing it?
Every week.
Okay.
So they're about, like I said, about 15, 20 minutes long. So once a week. There's only so much you can take because it's like really an intense story.
I know. I could tell you were really emotional delivering that there, which is, I thank you for getting through that with me. I'm sure it's not easy to do interviews on this, but I appreciate it.
Well, seriously, I was amazed that so many people were willing to talk about Phyllis. There were no one said no. Everyone said yes. Her family they were great interviews. They're just like her. Amazing. They
Yeah.
are just like her.
So,
So yeah, they made the podcast, so it made it a lot
and
easier for me.
if you heard, I kept mentioning today, I know it's actually
Oh
tomorrow,
no, I know. Mhm.
but this is airing tomorrow. So maybe what I'll do, and again, I don't want to cramp your time and take up too much. You're really busy, but maybe every couple of weeks, can I get back in touch with you and say, hey, last time we touched, I'm going to get in and listen to the podcast and take that all in. So I'll be updated on where we are in the story. But would you mind if I reached out to you every couple of weeks and we did a
Oh
recap?
no, that would be terrific. That would be
Okay.
terrific.
All right, I'll do that. Thank you so much. Good
Thank
job.
you.
Stay in touch whenever you need something, and I'll email you back. I have your cell phone as well, but I'll email you back and we'll try to set up another date in a couple of weeks.
Cool. Thank you,
All right.
Ray.
Have a great day.